Advice with Efimchik. Today, we're going to talk about convertible promissory notes and some mistakes that you may want to avoid. Before a company can raise an equity round of financing, these days, it usually will need to go to angel investors and get what's known as a bridge financing or convertible note financing, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Even though the point when a company goes out to raise this bridge financing, it's usually in a major cost savings mode, trying to save every penny, sometimes not working with lawyers, which is not something we recommend, but something we recognize happens. It's really important to avoid making mistakes because frankly, it's one of these things that you're not going to know you made the mistake until much later. The mistakes specifically that we're going to be talking about today, you're not going to know about until you raise financing or an equity round of financing, or until the maturity date, or until something changes and you need to modify the notes. So you may not know about the mistakes until much later, and yet they can have very dire consequences. So let's go over a few terms before we begin, just to make sure we're all on the same page and I'm not saying anything that kind of doesn't make sense. So the first term is just, what's a convertible note? Now, if you don't know what it is at all, I do have a very detailed blog post. The link is going to be underneath the video. You can go and read about a promissory note. You can read about all of the terms that typically go into a convertible promissory note. We're going to refer to it here either as a note or a promissory note or a convertible promissory note. It's all the same thing. What it is a loan by your investors, which in theory is supposed to be repaid. So it has a maturity date, it accrues interest, just like any loan obligation. But what differentiates it from any other loan is that the idea is that this loan will convert into equity securities, into shares of the startup that's raising the capital, and that's the value proposition. That's what everybody wants, both the startup and the investors. And when we talk about equity securities or an equity financing, so equity is shares and an equity financing is a priced valuation round. So a bridge financing or a convertible note financing is not an equity financing, it's a debt or a convertible debt financing. The reason that an equity financing is going to be important is because these notes will typically provide for automatic conversion on a qualified equity financing. What makes it qualified is that it meets certain requirements, which are going to be set in the convertible note, in which the parties agree on ahead of time. It might mean that the company needs to raise at least a particular amount of money. That's usually actually what it's going to entail, is that it needs to raise a particular amount of money, maybe $500,000 to $1 million, maybe more, maybe $10 million, depending on the round. So those are going to be the two key terms that we're going to be talking about. And now let's delve into the mistakes that you're going to want to avoid. So the first mistake that we're going to talk about today is one that actually a lot of companies make. In fact, this is not part of the standard forms, and it's not so much a mistake as kind of a practice tip. A lot of lawyers will not do this either, and then it will create problems for the company later. So this creates problems when a company raises an equity financing round. And it seems like this is the sort of ideal situation. There's a term sheet on the table from investors. There's a high valuation, much higher than the valuation cap of the notes. Everything seems to be going well, but the vast majority of the notes will provide that they convert automatically in the event of this qualified equity financing. So in our example, the company has a term sheet for this qualified equity financing. But let's suppose that the capped value what the new investors won't agree to is a 10x liquidation preference on those converted shares, on the shares that converted from the notes. Because if they get $1 for each share, but they only paid 10 cents, that's a 10x liquidation preference. So that's not acceptable. Now, if your notes don't specifically provide that they will convert into the same or a shadow series of preferred if requested by the new investor, then you could be in a situation when your existing investors, these note holders, well, they could play ball and they could say, certainly we understand, we'll amend, or they could be more difficult. And they could put you in a situation where this wonderful new investment that you could otherwise close is going to be derailed. It could it could take much longer than it otherwise would, or it could, the new investor could walk away if the existing investors are just not acting reasonably. And this leads into one of the other mistakes that we're going to talk about, and it's the ability to change the notes to say what you need them to say. And so I think this example illustrates well how important it is to be able to change the notes if most of your investors are reasonable, and not to have a holdout who's going to sabotage the whole transaction. So the second mistake that we're going to talk about today concerns with a situation that folks don't always anticipate. Unfortunately, it happens more often than we all like, and that's a situation where the amount of time that a company has to raise this qualified equity financing and convert the note, that amount of time expires. We get to a maturity date, which is the date when the company is supposed to repay the loan. But if they haven't raised new money, it's unlikely they're going to have the funds necessary to repay the loan. And frankly, nobody usually, unless things are going really badly, wants to be repaid. That's not why the investors are taking this huge risk investing in a really early stage company. They just don't want their money back plus 3, 4, 5, 6, 8% interest. That's not the game. The game is that they want some equity, and the reason that they're investing using a convertible note mechanism initially is because it's cheaper, simpler, allows the company to bring in capital quickly and then focus on the business and not on the mechanics of raising a financing. So let's say this has occurred. Usually a maturity date will be 1 to 2 years. Sometimes it's shorter than that if the company is very optimistic and sets expectations with investors that they'll raise a financing in 6 months. So the maturity date has expired, it needs to repay the loan, and it can't. Now, if there's no special provision in the note about what happens in this situation, this could be very unpleasant. On the one hand, the investors could be very reasonable and they could say, you guys are doing well, we understand that things don't always go according to plan, so perfectly understandable, we'll extend the amount of time that you have, all fine. But we can't always rely on people being reasonable, we can't always rely on best case scenarios, unfortunately. So what happens if the investors don't say that? What happens if the investors say, no, you need to pay me, the company doesn't have the money? Potentially the investors could take the company to court. They could try to have the company sell its assets. I mean, this is not a secured loan, but it could get pretty unpleasant, and it could certainly derail the company from doing its business and trying to grow the company into some kind of a confrontation with their investors. Usually if the investors are not going to be playing ball, if they're not going to extend the maturity date just by the goodness of their hearts, then most likely they will ask for something in return in order to extend it. So they will be, the company will be in a kind of a hostage situation where they're going to have to give something up in order to not get sued by the investors. So not a situation that anybody wants to be in. Hopefully it doesn't come to that, but one way to make sure it doesn't come to that is to provide in the original note that should the maturity date come before the notes convert and before a qualified equity financing, then there will be an automatic conversion on the maturity date, and then the note needs to provide the formula and the mechanism for that conversion. Now, there's several things to think about. First of all, since there's no qualified financing, we can't talk about converting into the securities that are being issued in this other financing. So we need to decide what securities are going to be issued. Is it going to be common stock? Is it going to be preferred stock? If it's common stock, it's pretty straightforward. If it's preferred stock, is it going to be a new series of preferred stock if the company has no preferred stock? Or maybe the company already has another series of preferred stock, and then this note could convert into that. If it's a new series of preferred stock, then the note needs to provide at least some basic terms for that series of preferred. What are going to be its rights, preferences, and privileges, because that's going to be important for actually effectuating the conversion when the time comes. And of course, finally, you're going to need to provide for the mechanism for conversion. So either some kind of a valuation cap, or you could say, the investors as a group need to own a certain percent of the company. Sometimes it can get pretty punitive, but if parties agree to it ahead of time, then they agree to it ahead of time. I've certainly seen situations where investors say, if 2 years later you still haven't raised money, you don't have the money to repay us, then this converts such that we get control of the company. Now, that's not ideal for the company, but at least they know where the investors stand, and this is, they don't want those terms, they don't have to take them, but at least there are no surprises 2 years later when the company doesn't raise money. And finally, the last mistake, not least. This may seem like a very minor thing, but actually, let me assure you, it is not. So what we're going to talk about is the amendment provision. And before we get into that, what is an amendment provision? In any contract, that's the provision that tells you what it takes to change the terms of that agreement, that contract. Now, if we're talking about a simple contract between two people, a lessor and the lessee, or buy-sell agreement, we have two parties. Usually that agreement, and that makes perfect sense, can be amended if both parties agree, right? Now, if we have an agreement with, let's say, 15 parties, let's say we're talking about a shareholders agreement, we have 15 shareholders, we could certainly still have the same amendment provision that says everybody has to agree. But realistically, what is the likelihood that when we need to make some change, everybody's going to vote for it? Now, it may be that we want to be that restrictive and we really want everybody's unanimous consent on something, but from a practical perspective, in order to be able to run a company, we generally want to have amendment provisions that, if most people are on board, kind of let you move forward. And so in the context of a shareholders agreement, what that might look like is amendment by a majority in interest of the shareholders will be enough. So the holders of the most shares, more than half of the shares, will be able to change the agreement on behalf of everybody. But you might be saying, well, what does that have to do with our note? Because each time you sell a note, it's a separate instrument. If the company has 15 investors, it's going to sell 15 notes from the company to the individual investor. So that's not really the same situation as the shareholders agreement. And then that's true, although what I would say to that is, first of all, a lot of times this is part of a single bridge financing transaction. These notes are going to be on substantially the same terms, hopefully entirely the same terms, but sometimes that's not the case. Some investors may ask for slightly different terms. Hopefully these notes are sold under a single note purchase agreement, which also unifies them. And they usually will have a similar valuation cap or something like that. And I guess most importantly, all of these notes are going to convert in this qualified equity financing. That's the hope, that they're all going to convert into probably the same securities, the same series of shares. So we kind of want to treat them the same, and we want to have the ability to easily modify them if we need to. For example, like in the case that we talked about earlier, where we have a new investor and we need to modify the way that the notes are going to be converted. Because we just, at the moment when we're issuing notes, we just don't know what the terms of the equity financing might be. And even if it's not a shadow series of preferred issue, it could be any number of things. And we may want to tweak what the definition of qualified equity financing is, right? We may want to be able to bring down the threshold a little bit. Let's say it says $1 million, and we're only going to raise 970,000, and most investors may be okay with that. But what we don't want is to be held hostage by a single investor, or even by a small group of investors, or a group of investors that hold. It might be a large group, but that only invested a small amount in the aggregate. So it's very, very important to have a mechanism by which the majority of investors, or maybe some higher threshold if you need it, but keeping it as low as possible, so that's majority of investors, can make a decision on behalf of everyone, change all of the notes, not just their notes, and do what needs to be done to get some future transaction to happen without any problems. So hopefully this has been helpful. More materials are on my blog, and happy company making.